Homelessness is a problem that should be at the top of our list to cure as a species, along with hunger and disease. Sadly, the homeless population seems to increase every year. In the US alone, there are around 550,000 homeless people on a given night, according to endhomelessness.org. That's so many people suffering a true horror story every day, struggling to survive and maintain sanity. But when you're kept out in the open after dark, when there are no walls to shelter you, you end up experiencing things that defy all logic, things that keep you awake on those cold, damp nights. These are horror stories from the perspective of homeless people. If you have a scary story, share it with us at darkstories.org or reddit.com/r/darknessprevails, and I might narrate it. I'm looking for scary night shift experiences from foreigners. Now, let's begin. Life is rough. From Anonymous. As most of us do, I went through a very rough patch in my life. About 5 or so years ago, I was laid off from a well-paying factory job and estranged from my family due to a lot of infighting and disagreements. This hurricane of everything going wrong, it happened at the same time, and put me in a situation where all I had left was a broken-down truck that stopped running in a hardware store parking lot, and the clothes on my back and whatever was left in my truck. I was homeless for about 6 or 7 months or so. For as long as I could, I pleaded with the owner of that hardware store not to tow away my truck. I explained my situation. I had to live in that darn truck. I couldn't afford to stay anywhere else, and those homeless shelters we had were always full, no matter where I went or when I went. It was all I had to keep me warm. You see, nights were getting well below the 20-degree mark. I could quite literally freeze to death if I didn't have that truck. He did what he could for as long as he could, but he was getting tired of seeing that truck out there. This ended up happening the day before he eventually towed it, but luckily this was only about a couple of weeks before I finally got back on my feet again. A bit of a close call, I think. So yeah, my truck had been parked at the edge of a hardware store when it broke down. The parking lot itself bordered a field. So let me get into the night that it happened. I was trying to get some sleep. It was dark out, must have been around 11:30 p.m. or so. So there wasn't anyone left in the parking lot but me, and there was no one driving around on the roads. It was a fairly small town after all. But the problem that night by night began to grow on me as I slept in that truck were the windows. The truck's windows were not at all tinted, and the darkness of the fields nearby, accompanied with the fact that I was sleeping in the middle of a public area, meant that I did not feel secure or safe at all. So, feeling a bit eerie, I decided to take some of my torn-up work clothes I had in the back seat and tie them up over the windows so that I could not see out of them and no one could see inside. Sadly, I wasn't able to do this for the windshield. It was just too big, and I didn't have enough spare clothes. But the way I was laying, I couldn't see much of the windshield anyway. It was just the driver and passenger windows that bothered me. So after blocking those windows with some old dirty closed curtains, I tried to fall asleep, when suddenly the shirt I'd tied to the driver's side window fell down. This begins my hardship with trying to get that shirt to stay tied to that window. The little hook that pops out over the window was broken. It had been broken for a long time, so when I tied the shirt to it, it just kept slowly sliding off. This happened several times. It was a pain. Eventually, I tied it into a real good knot. This managed to work, but not permanently. It worked long enough for me to fall asleep, But because of my nervousness and having to fidget with that window so much, my body ended up waking itself up, as if it was telling me to check the window again, just in case that shirt had fallen off. So I looked at the window and saw that the shirt was still there, so I turned over. But I nudged the window just right with my foot, causing the shirt to fall down once more. I sighed and lifted myself up. I picked up the shirt, then looked back at the window, and I screamed. There was someone at my driver's side window, and they were staring at me. It appeared to be a young woman with jet black hair and an oval-shaped face. Her skin was as pale as the moon. I'd never seen skin that color before. But the problem with this woman, what made me realize this wasn't right, it was her eyes first. Her eyes were solid white. At first I thought she had her eyes closed, but I could see her eyelashes pointing upwards on the top. Her eyes were wide open, but they were as pale as her skin, with no pupils. Then I saw her mouth, which was almost normal, except her lower row of teeth at the front were stabbing through her lower lip, as if she had fallen forward so hard her teeth were shoved through and got stuck there. She was bleeding through the wound. She slid her hand down the window and tapped it with her index finger just a bit, just enough that I could hear it. She then spoke to me in what amounted to little more than a whisper, but the night was quiet enough that I could hear what she said.
Stay warm.
Stay warm, she had said. She stared at me for a long time, never blinking, but she was definitely breathing, as her breaths were fogging up the window. Eventually, she turned toward the field and walked away. In a panic, though I was scared, I jumped out of the truck. I had to check on her. She looked injured. She looked like she was on the verge of death. She wasn't in the field by the time I got out, which didn't make sense at all. I went to scour the field myself, but I never saw her again. There was no trace of her. But I was still horrified. I ran over to the nearest police station. I reported what I saw. When a police cruiser and a couple of cops came out to check, they thought I was on drugs. They didn't find her either. There were no footsteps. There weren't even any fingerprints left on my window. To this day, I've gotten no idea if it was a woman on the verge of dying after an accident, or if it was some spirit coming to check on me. She didn't feel scary. She didn't have the intent to hurt me, I don't think, and her voice seemed kind. If the woman was alive, then I hope she's okay and she got the help she needed. But if she wasn't, well, thank you. After Dark Voices, from TJ All Day 21. I was living in Long Island, New York at the time. I was dead broke and homeless. I was desperate for a job and had quite a few altercations with people, whether physical, mental, or emotional. Mostly mental. I was living in this shelter for a few months. There were females there, but not many. Those that were there were either old, or they were used-up drug heads begging for either clothes or food in the morning. One night after falling asleep, I woke up at about 3 o'clock in the morning. I sat there staring at the wall, thinking over things, wondering how in the world I was going to get myself out of this situation. When unexpectedly, I received a phone call from an unknown number. Yeah, even homeless folks sometimes have phones. I went ahead and answered the call. "Hello?" I said, and at first I almost thought I could make out the words, but it was so echoed and staticky that I couldn't make out much of anything. The other end, there seemed to be multiple voices speaking in unison, and as I answered a couple more times, the voices only grew louder, as if they were speaking to me, but were growing frustrated that I didn't understand. Eventually, I got goosebumps all over. I hung up the phone, but the voices continued for a few more moments. I covered my ears until they stopped, and when they did, I realized that what I had experienced was not of this world, and I had no earthly idea what it was. Was I just randomly visited by the voices of a spirit? But why? Why me? I'll never sleep in the streets again. From Bellow. I live in the northwest of the United States. It gets insanely cold, and as I had been homeless for a year, I'm honestly surprised that I even lived through it. I actually did lose 2 fingers on my left hand from frostbite during that time. Things did get better for me. Eventually, I scored a job as a janitor from an extremely nice employer. He even allowed me to sleep in the storeroom until I could afford an apartment. This was the kind of help that changed everything. But this happened long before that. When I was homeless, I spent my days on the road, holding up a sign begging for spare change in cash or food. At first, I did hold a sign that was asking for work, but I never really got responses for it. Now, before sundown every night, I would settle into my nest. This was a bundled up mass of newspaper and loose paper inside the biggest cardboard box I could find. I would sleep under 3 tossed jackets. Used to be 4, but another homeless person had lifted it off of me while I slept. It's really live or die out there. Now, my box was pretty good and sturdy, but it only had 3 sides, as the 4th side had collapsed outward. I kept it that way, because it acted as a sort of entrance. I kept this little nest of mine at the end of an alleyway in the district of town where there's a bunch of old brick buildings. I guess you could say it was the oldest part of town. Now, at the edge of this alley, the town turns to forest and brush that was very much unmanaged. It was so bad it was starting to look like a jungle. Now, one night I was sleeping in my nest when something nudged me awake. It felt as if someone had tugged at my pant leg. I was too exhausted to care too much, so I grunted and pulled back. Then there was an immediate tug as a response, another one, but this time it was hard enough to yank my entire body halfway out of the box. I was wide awake now, and a bit scared, as well as kind of angry. Someone came up to me to attack me in my sleep, and I was not happy about it. Before I could even speak, dish out a warning, or even kick into fight or flight mode, whatever had been tugging at me began to drag me away. I could then feel a set of sharp somethings pressing into my boot. I soon realized that my attacker was dragging me into the brush and in the woods. We passed through the forest edge. I tried yanking away from the thing, tried kicking it, but for the longest time it wouldn't let up. The more the light of the town faded, the more I began to freak out. Eventually, whatever was attacking me let me go, but it wasn't because I'd hit it. It let me go on its own decision. I crawled backward a bit, quickly cutting myself on thorns that were behind me. There was just enough light from the town that I could see a bit in front of me, a thin pillar of light. I could see multiple sets of eyes around me, circling me. These things seemed to be walking on all fours. They were animals, that I was certain of. I assumed that they were coyotes, maybe wild dogs. But then, a sound began to erupt from these entities that I was not expecting. It was laughter. It was human-style laughter, as if a group of teenagers had heard the funniest joke in the world. I figured that if anything, this was just some weird coyote sounds I hadn't heard before. If they were coyotes, I'd never been this close to one before, so that made sense to me. I mean, what else could it be? Suddenly, two of them stepped into the light, and I got a good look at what I was dealing with. Their faces were completely flat. They didn't have pointed snouts like canines would. These creatures were also extremely thin, sort of aerodynamic looking, with large, wide mouths on their faces. They horrified me and confused me, but I didn't care what they were at the moment. If I didn't get out of there, I was going to die. So I picked myself up in a hurry and I ran away from them, scratching my entire body as I went through the brush. That whole time, I could hear them crawling through the brush after me. I was able to make it back to the alley, but they were following me there too. Before they were on me, I'd grabbed my box and I was dragging it away toward the street. Luckily, they weren't interested in going beyond the alleyway. They seemed hesitant of entering the street, so I began to walk down the road, trying to find somewhere safe. Every time I passed an alleyway and looked back toward the woods, I could see those animals following me. I could still hear them laughing in the distance. I made my way to the center of town, though it was really early in the morning and no one would be awake at the moment. It was my best bet to get away from those things. At the center of town there is a fountain with some benches around it. I sat there with my box in tow, trying to think of what I was going to do. I sat there all night, shivering in the cold, wondering what my life even was anymore. I needed to find a new place to sleep. I had tried the homeless shelters before, but they were always too competitive to get into. You could wait there for hours, but the bunks would be filled by the time you got in. It wasn't worth the time I could spend finding somewhere better, and then trying to find some food. I decided when the sun came up, I would start looking. Eventually, I found one of the old buildings that had a fire escape at the side, one that was low enough to the ground that I could jump up to it. As stealthily as I could, I climbed up the fire escape, but I had to throw my box in there first, which was a pain because most of the newspapers fell out. But whatever. Once up there, I walked through the fire escape stairs, and I made it to the roof of the building. It was vacant. There was a structure with a door on it where the stairway would be. So I decided to prop up my box, my little nest, behind that structure, as I would less likely be seen. As I settled in for that night, happy that I'd found something good, I heard something that made my stomach twist into little violent knots. Those things, they must have had my scent or something. I could hear laughing coming from the bottom of the building. I even heard claws scraping at the wall, as if they were trying to jump up and get into the fire escape. And if they did, I was cornered on a roof, and I would not be able to live through it. Thankfully, they weren't able to reach the fire escape, and after a few nights of this, I never heard from them again, never saw them again, and I spent the remainder of my homeless life on this roof. No one ever found me. No one came up there, really. And I didn't get a good night's sleep until I finally got myself a job. This experience motivated me more than anything, that once I was off the streets, I would rather die than go back. Sleeping in a graveyard is a bad idea. From SandyEric. I don't know why I thought sleeping anywhere near a cemetery would be a good idea in the slightest. So I was your typical hobo, slept in a different spot every night, often asked fast food chains for any old food they could give out, tried not to ask for money, and instead would ask for work. I could do odd jobs here and there, though I didn't have any tools, but I could lift if necessary. That was my life until finally my cousin moved into town and took me in. But during my time as a homeless person, I ended up getting real irritated with other people, particularly with other homeless people. Around those parts, they could get troublesome. They would try to take any cash or items you'd picked up for themselves. Some of them were opportunists, and they would take any chance they got to get ahead. I had a guy run past me once, took a sandwich basically out of my mouth while I was eating. Those folks wanted to compete instead of work together, and it made it harder for everybody. So for a long time there, I tried my best to find places to sleep that were more alone and distant from people. Of all places, I ended up trying to stay at an old cemetery. This particular cemetery was full. They didn't use it to bury folks anymore. There was a newer cemetery uptown anyway that they used. So I was quite alone staying there. And for the first few nights, I wasn't bothered. Around the fourth night I was there, I then figured out just how bad of an idea it was to sleep in graveyards. I woke up in the middle of the night to see someone standing over me. They were talking to me and nudging me awake. I think they kept saying, "You can't stay here." I rubbed my tired eyes and realized that there were actually dozens of people around me. They were dressed weird, dressed in different garbs from seemingly a different time. My very first thought was that I was in some sort of late-night rehearsal of a reenactment or play or something. I started to pick myself up, feeling embarrassed. When things like this happen, and you're homeless, you can't really help but feel called out on your bad place in life. I apologized as I grabbed my pile of clothes and quickly put them back in an old reused trash bag. I glanced back up and realized some of the people around me, they were sort of transparent. Each one of them was staring at me without blinking, and I noticed that none of them were even breathing. The man who had been nudging me awake then placed his hand on my shoulder, whispering, "Best of luck." His hand was colder than ice, I swear to God. Quickly getting creeped out, I took my stuff and began to leave, constantly glancing back over my shoulder here and there. And in the matter of a couple of seconds between glances, the people were completely gone, all several dozen of them. Obviously, that didn't make sense. I wasn't that tired, and it was physically impossible. From that night onward, I stopped sleeping in cemeteries. There were much better places to stay, even if I had to deal with real, tangible people who were a pain in my butt, because the last thing I wanted to do was wake the dead. Because if you piss off the dead, who knows what they'll do to you. Then again, that man did wish me good luck after all. Dumpster diving, from New Greg 121. This is a story from my granddad. Before he married and settled down, he was homeless for a time. My granddad was a different kind of guy back then. He had run away from family the moment he turned 16. He didn't like the idea of working for someone, so he didn't want to work. He figured he could live for himself, live naturally, he told himself, but that's not at all what it ended up being like. And he would tell us stories as kids, trying to motivate us, trying to tell us how bad it would be if you ever end up homeless. It didn't so much motivate me as it depressed me. He would explain how, at the worst of times back then, he would have to sleep in the streets, and he even ate food out of a dumpster a few times. He did tell me of one unsettling experience he had on a certain occasion, an experience that he claims changed his mindset. It was winter, and he was dumpster diving, trying to find anything he could use. Usually that involved old clothes, cleanish cardboard, and clean newspaper, any sort of cloth or sheet. Keeping warm and dry was of the utmost priority if you didn't want to freeze to death. Freezing to death happens a lot to homeless people. When you're inside warm walls, you don't really understand how the elements can destroy a person. My granddad soon began to notice that within the dumpster, there was a large gathering of rats and insects piling up on the same spot. Underneath that pile of nasty, he spotted some cloth clothes, so he picked up some dirty cardboard and began to scrape away at them, trying to get them out of the way so he could get his prize. When he had most of them scraped off, he realized what they were on. He was face to face with a carcass. Those rats and insects were crawling all over and chewing on a man's face. An older man who had been partially eaten. His eyes were gone, because, as my granddad told me, when you pass on, animals usually go for the soft, tender flesh, and that includes the eyeballs. Yeah, pretty disgusting, I know. Turns out, this person was yet another homeless person who had taken up refuge in a dumpster trying to keep himself warm. But he passed in the night. My granddad isn't sure if it was disease, starvation, or exposure. He figured he did freeze to death, as it was pretty cold that previous night. Altogether, my granddad wasn't surprised. Still, this encounter horrified him, and drove my granddad to do whatever he could to get off the streets and stay off. It took some time and some hard work. He had to take makeshift showers and baths and restrooms at the sink to keep himself clean, and when he did find clean clothes that fit him, he risked life and limb to keep them clean so that he could be interviewed for jobs. Eventually, he landed one. This led to him getting off the streets, and one day he eventually started his own business. He was able to get married, had kids, and those kids had kids that he eventually told his stories to. Stories that definitely worked on me, because I will do whatever it takes not to be homeless. I saw what it did to my granddad, and though that experience did get him off the streets, I'd rather avoid finding a dead guy in a dumpster. If anything, I'm pretty motivated to help out at homeless shelters when I can, because in this country, I don't think we do enough for them. Blistering cold winters, boiling hot summers, and other especially feisty homeless people. These aren't the only things you need to worry about if you ever find yourself living on the streets, because some very peculiar animals and even restless spirits will be interested in the meat that makes up you. So be careful. Always have something in your savings, and always have a backup plan. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode of Darkness Prevails, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have a story that you want narrated on the channel, share it with us at darkstories.org or reddit.com/r/darknessprevails. I'm interested in hearing stories from foreigners about their night shift experiences. If you want to support the show, check the links in the description. There's a link to my Patreon where you can donate and keep us afloat. And there's a link to my merch store, where every purchase of a creepy shirt supports us. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode, but don't you worry, because more scary stories are on the way soon. They always are. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're my favorite kind of creeps. Remember, stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.